Hey guys, it's me, Sam Stein, managing editor of the Bulwark. Last night they did pass a government funding bill, but I wanted to talk a little bit about something we've been reporting on and commenting on, which is the provisions in that bill that were meant for pediatric cancer research, funding, and treatments. Before I get into it, as always, do subscribe to the YouTube feed. We really appreciate it. Allows us to do things like this, walk you through some pretty complex issues. So let me start out with a little bit of the backstory, and then we can get to the good news and then the bad news. Backstory is this. Earlier this week, they introduced a bill to fund the government. It was 1,500 or so pages long, and in it were a bunch of additional provisions beyond just funding the government. And among those provisions were four in particular that matter to people who care about pediatric cancer. One was funds for the Gabriel Miller Act, which is basically money to the NIH to fund pediatric cancer research. Another was a provision that would have allowed an FDA waiver so that people with rare pediatric cancer can have dual treatments. Right now, you're only allowed to get one under the FDA regulations. This would allow combination treatments. In addition, there was a provision that would have allowed people who are on Medicaid, kids on Medicaid, poor kids, to get Medicaid coverage across state lines if they had to travel for cancer treatment. And then the final one, which I think people in the community really cared about, they cared about all of them, of course, but this one was specific to a couple of them, which is sometimes there are smaller pharmaceutical companies that are working on cancer treatments, and those can be really expensive to bring to market. Takes a lot of time to research them, prove their efficacy. What this provision would have done is given those smaller companies a voucher, which they could have sold to a larger pharmaceutical company, and that would have allowed them to get the funds to continue to research medicines and treatments for kids with cancer. You have to understand, not really a profitable line of work because there are not as many kids with cancer. It's rare. And so oftentimes pharmaceutical companies don't want to invest in this type of treatment because they are profit seeking. Anyways, those were the four provisions. They were all in the first bill. Elon Musk tweeted about how bad the bill was. Trump said he wanted the bill destroyed. They took out a lot of provisions, including those four. Now, there's been some back and forth over whether that's Elon or Trump's fault or whether it was the fault of the Senate Democrats, because, and here's the truth, some of those provisions had passed earlier in the year as House bills, and they had not been taken up by the Senate. People said, oh, this shows that Chuck Schumer is responsible for this. And maybe you feel that way. Senate tends to work in kind of mysterious ways, but one thing you should know is that any senator at any time can object to consideration of a bill, and that means that it takes many, many hours to push that bill through all the procedural hurdles, which means that the Senate is then kind of ground to a halt to consider those bills. And the Senate doesn't really like doing that. They preserve and they like their time, they prioritize it. And so if someone's going to object to a bill, it could really screw things up for them. And that's why they didn't move those four bills. But usually what happens is what happened in this case. If it's a really important bill for them, they try to tack it on at the end of the year to a must-pass bill, like a government funding bill. And that's what happened this time. So you may hate the process, but that is what happened. And frankly, it was a binary choice by the end. You could have voted to include those four provisions, or you could have said, no, they need to come out because anything we do to fund the government should just be seen as clean, as in it should just continue what we have going. They took it out. Now, everyone presumed that this was the end of it. All those four provisions would be lost as they continue to debate how to fund the government. And then something kind of crazy happened. Last night, the House passed a very slimmed down government funding bill, and then the Senate followed suit, and it passed the same exact bill, which meant that it could go to President Biden's desk and become law. And then after the Senate was done, they decided that they were going to do a separate vote on the Gabriella Miller Act. And again, if any senator objected to it, that meant that it wasn't going to pass because it was going to take many, many hours to go through all the procedural hurdles, and they just didn't have the time for it. And yeah, well, they brought the Gabriel Miller Act up for a vote, and lo and behold, it passed by unanimous consent. Now, it wasn't the same one as the original bill. It was only 5 years as opposed to 7. It was about 12 million or a little bit over $12 million a year in research. It's going to add up to about 60 plus $1 million. But it's a victory. It's money for pediatric cancer research. Frankly, I talked to some Hill aides and lawmakers last night. They did not even see this coming. It was miraculous for them. They were shocked, and they were incredibly, incredibly grateful that it happened. They had been basically planning to just go back into the trenches in the next Congress and do it all over again. Now they don't have to do that, at least for 5 years. But what about the other 3 provisions? Well, those 2 were brought to a vote. In each of those cases, a senator did object. It was Rand Paul, and you can see the objection in this video here.
In a moment, I will ask for unanimous consent to pass H.R. 3433, the Bipartisan Give Kids a Chance Act. I'd like to highlight how important this legislation is for children with cancer all across this country.
Is there objection?
Mr. President,
Senator from Kentucky.
I object.
Objection is heard. Senator from Colorado.
Mr. President, I just want to say how deeply I regret the objection of the senator from Kentucky. The idea that we're not going to be able to pass this legislation is deeply, deeply disappointing to the people who have advocated for this for all these years. It's a reflection, I think, of how broken this place is and the way that it puts its own interests ahead of the interests of the people that we represent.
So there you see it. Rand Paul saying, I object, which means that they cannot consider it by unanimous consent, which means those 3 provisions will not become law. It could in the next Congress, but they'd have to pass those bills separately in the House and the Senate. And that's, it's hard. Probably won't happen. People are pretty devastated about that. The funding obviously is important. It matters, even if it's pared down. $60 million is nothing to scoff at. But people with kids who are suffering from cancer will not have the ability to get those combination treatments if they want them. Small pharmaceutical companies that are trying to work on cancer drugs, it's going to be tough to get the funding that they need now, whereas they could have had the voucher. And then, of course, obviously the Medicaid provision that allowed kids on Medicaid to cross the line and have Medicaid cover their treatments, that's not going to happen. So, yeah, that's where we're at. I think it was a difficult process for many to follow because I think a lot of people who were following this process just hadn't, and it's fair, they just had little familiarity with how these things tend to work. And I just want to emphasize there was just a lot of back and forth over how these things are supposed to happen. And I think in an ideal world, you should be able to have both chambers pass standalone bills on important issues and then have them go up to the President of the United States, who would then sign it. Nothing seems objectionable. I don't think anyone really objects to the idea of funding cancer research. If they do, it's probably on the grounds that it's duplicative or that, maybe I guess some people think that it should just be a private sector function. But I think by and large, most people think, yeah, this is important. But this past week, we didn't have that debate. We were at a place where funding for research was going to lapse, and there was only one ticket to continue it. And initially was pulled out. And luckily, at the last minute, it got put back in. But I do want to just note some of this stuff really, people were, incensed by it. And this one tweet in particular kind of stood out to me. It's from Jason Calacanis. He is a entrepreneur, host of the All In podcast, which is one of those Elon Musk loving, Trump curious, Trump supportive podcasts. Kind of became pretty popular during the election. David Sachs, one of the co-hosts, is now in the administration. He said, he's supportive of what Elon Musk is trying to do. And he tweeted, Doge, that's the Department of Government Efficiency, is working. When they pulled the kids with cancer card, I just, that one really stuck out to me. Like, no one was pulling a kids with cancer card. I mean, people worked for 4 or 5, 6 years on these provisions. The people who were working on them, at least in 2 cases, had children who died of cancer. Nancy Goodman is one of them. She's been on TV. I talked to her for a story. Her 10-year-old kid died of brain cancer. she wanted this to pass in the continuing resolution. It didn't make it through. She wasn't playing a card. This was her last chance to see these provisions pass. And I think to kind of dismiss her advocacy as an attempt to make Elon Musk look bad is kind of disrespectful to her. And that's just my own piece. I know I'm not supposed to opinionate or anything like that, but just found that to be a little bit off-putting. And I encourage Jason, if he wants to talk about it, I doubt he's listened to this, but we could talk about the process and why it didn't work in a smooth way, but why, at least one element did end up into law. But that's where we stand now. So a small victory last night for pediatric cancer research, but 3 defeats, and now they have to pick it up in the next Congress, and we'll see what happens. Thank you for following this entire thing, this entire process with us. It's been chaotic, eventful. We're generally appreciative of your readership and support, and we're going to continue to cover this, and we hope you follow the storylines with us. Thanks.